people are looking at your face and my face, and yeah. I mean, already this is scary, but they should realize that some deep, intelligent things are going to happen because we've got two bearded guys.
I know, and it makes such a difference.
Yeah, we could stroke the chin hairs and initiate deep thought, right? So
switch it on. Switch it on.
That's right. So this is the Wild Theology Podcast, and I'm Phil Wyman, and I call it Wild Theology because God, the world, and the people in it are all wilder than we've been told. It's time for us to dig into something that has been a fundamental topic, a fundamental practice of the Evangelical Church, certainly as long as I've been alive. And so it must go all the way back to Jesus. I mean, he must have started this thing. We're talking about the altar call. And this is David Malcolm Bennett. He's in Australia, although he was originally born upside down in England. And has since flipped to the other side of the world, and he's standing upright. David did some master's work on this topic of a thesis being the history and origins of the altar call. He's written a book on the history and origins of the sinner's prayer, and did a doctoral work on the history and origins of the Left Behind Theology, right? So he's a man who's been looking at some of the heart of things happening within the Evangelical Church. So Jesus gave us the altar call, right, David?
Did he?
Well,
can't say I noticed.
No, it wasn't.
I know it was the Gospel to Charlie. It was in the Gospel to Charlie. That's where it's found. Definitely.
It wouldn't be Charlie Finney, would it?
No, it wouldn't actually, but there we
are. Okay, so so this is a funny thing. In starting to look into this, that was I also looked into the origins of the sinner's prayer, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And is it Chitwood? Is that his name? Who wrote the book Chitwood? On the sin? Yeah,
Paul Chitwood.
Paul Chitwood, on his paper on the sinner's prayer, his doctoral thesis. He writes about going to a librarian of a major evangelical seminary and saying to him, "I'm looking for something on the origins of the sinner's prayer." And the librarian looked at him kind of blankly, like, "Well, it's in the Bible, isn't it?" And just kind of shut off the conversation and walked away. and he thought, I'm talking to the librarian at the seminary, and he's got this same misinformation that a lot of people do. But so with the altar call, tell us about this. What are the origins of this thing?
Well, perhaps I better first define what I mean by the altar call, just to put it in the picture. I like definitions. Not everybody does. I do. Okay, it is a method of evangelism within which a regular or frequent planned invitation is given to unbelievers to respond to Jesus Christ publicly at the conclusion of a sermon or other gospel presentation in such ways as calling out a response, raising a hand, standing or walking to a designated spot in the evangelistic setting. A response to such an invitation would normally be followed by immediate counseling and later by some form of follow-up. It often incorporates an appeal to Christians for such issues as rededication or call to mission. It is not a theology, though it does reflect and support particular theologies. That's my definition.
So that definition,
what I'm working with.
Right.
Yep.
So that definition makes quite a bit of sense for the beginnings of my pastoring. So I was 26 years old and I took over a small Foursquare church in Carlsbad, California. And we used to have monthly reports to fill out. And in the monthly reports, you were supposed to say every month you had a little box for how many salvations, how many recommitments, how many baptisms with the Holy Spirit. And then outside of that thinking, was the box for water baptisms, right? But the way in which that was asked on a monthly basis, even though it wasn't a rule of the church that you did an altar call every message, it wasn't a written rule. Those little boxes were unspoken rules with high expectations.
Yes. I think the thing which really triggered this with me was the issue of, did the great 18th century evangelists, John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards, did they do it? This is the sort of thing which seemed to me to be crucial. Right. Did these great evangelists do it? And it seemed to be significant to me if they did or if they didn't. And because they were obviously very successful evangelists. Now, I'm not aware of anyone who says Jonathan Edwards gave an altar call. I'm pretty sure he didn't, and I don't know of anyone who says he did. I don't know of anyone who says that George Whitefield gave an altar call. And again, I'm pretty sure he didn't.
Right.
But when it comes to John Wesley, the issue has been clouded because there are some people who say in books and even in at least one academic dissertation that John Wesley did give altar calls. Now, I've read John Wesley's journal from 1738 to the last entry. I've read at least 45 of his sermons, some of them twice, some of them 3 times. I've read his instructions to preachers. I've read at least 3 biographies of John Wesley and written one. And I am convinced that John Wesley did not use the altar call. So if that is all right, that's correct, then you've got 3 great evangelists in the 18th century who did not use the altar call, but they were extremely successful evangelists. Now that forces me to ask 2 questions. One is, when did this begin and how did it begin? Or that's all one question. And the other one is it necessary? I mean, if they didn't use it, if I'm right there and they were highly successful evangelists, lots and lots of conversions, do we need to use it?
Right. Yeah, and particularly with Wesley and Whitefield, we have perhaps what's the beginning of mass evangelism as we understand it, coming into the 19th and 20th century.
Yes, that's right.
And there perhaps
you certainly have that.
Yeah, and there you expect it perhaps to be used out of like a necessity. How do we separate out from this crowd who might be interested, right? But you don't see them using it.
No. I'm convinced they didn't use it. But
okay.
It's almost impossible to improve to prove a no, to prove that somebody didn't do something.
Right.
You can't really prove it because something may be hidden there which nobody ever discovers. But certainly I've not seen any evidence of them ever using it, and I think that's a very important factor.
So we don't have it with Wesley. We don't have it with Edwards, Wesley, Whitefield.
Yeah.
Where does it pop up?
Okay. Well, some people say it goes back to the New Testament, and the only incident where I think one could argue for it is the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2.
Right.
How did they identify the 2,000 people for baptism? You might guess, and it would be a guess that it happened then, but there's no details, no information of that kind to demonstrate that it happened. But I mean, I couldn't say it didn't happen. That would be stupid. But there's no evidence, no clear evidence that it did.
No, it almost seems as though it's an inverse altar call, because what we have is, rather than, and if you want to be saved, do this, you have them saying, what must we do to be saved? Yes. It's inverted.
Yes. That's right. And also, I have not found anything else in the Bible which really supports the altar call. Not really. Not the altar call as I have defined it, and I'm sticking within my definition there. So then we get to the situation where what seemed to be, when at least in my original research, the first instance of this practice that I found was in the ministry of a gentleman called Eleazar Wheelock in Massachusetts, Taunton, Massachusetts. In 1741, November 1741, the congregation got a bit chaotic. They what must I do to be saved? What must I do to be saved? And so on. And so he just said, well, what do I do? So he said, come out here and, we'll talk to you. So that seemed to me originally to be the first instance. It was the first incident that I identified. And after that, it did gradually become common, not necessarily influenced by that. I don't know that Wheelock ever did it again, but it did become popular in at least, it did become used at least in one Baptist group. At the end of the 18th century, some Methodists were using it, and I think some Congregationalists were using it as well. But their language of describing it is open to more than one interpretation. I made an invitation, that sort of thing. What does that mean? So their language is not terribly specific. So you've got really this coming to the fore at the end of the 18th century. Now, I've been trumped, and it's okay. Well, am I allowed to say trumped with Americans?
Yeah, well.
Okay, well, I've been trumped.
It's not always popular.
Okay, well, someone has found an earlier one, Dr. Thomas Johnston, who I think is in the Western Baptist Theological Seminary. He's found an earlier incident, and that's fine by me. I'm not saying mine was the first. I'm saying it's the first I found.
Right.
So he's found one among the Huguenots in France. Now, the situation was, if you're familiar with the Huguenots, they were persecuted rather savagely by the Catholics, by the authorities, and so some reneged and became Catholics. And was a Huguenot preacher called Claude Brisson, who travelled around preaching to these people who had become Catholics, and he preached the gospel to them, and he invited them to come forward to rejoin the Huguenots.
Okay.
Well, rejoin Christ, I guess, was his thinking. So the date I've got for that, and this is, as I say, from Dr. Johnson, was 1689.
Okay.
So we're back now to 1689.
Right.
But I have not found one earlier than that.
Right. But through those examples, these tended to be one-off experiences.
Yes.
It didn't create a standard at this time.
It didn't. Some Huguenots did go to America, and I've done a little bit of work trying to see if there was any link between the Huguenots who went to America and what happened in America. But I didn't find it, and I thought it a bit unlikely because the situation in America was totally different to what it was in France. People weren't being tortured and persecuted because they were Catholics. at least not in any major way.
Right.
So I don't think the practice would have been transported from the French to the American situation. I think the American situation emerged independently.
Okay. And now, so when do you see this in this history? When do you see it starting to be standardized? That what we would, the initiate, that what was the evangelical would become this evangelical movement. When did we start using it regularly?
Okay, the real kickoff, and this is all before Finney, please notice. I mean, Finney was alive at what I'm going to say.
Okay.
He was a nice little boy at the time.
Right.
But it didn't start with Finney. People make a big mistake. You look on different places, they say Finney started. Finney didn't start it. He got in on the act later.
Okay.
But you've got to go to the American camp meetings. The American camp meetings, 1800, 1820, that block of 20 years there.
Okay, right.
They were wild and woolly. They were on the American frontier. The American frontier, where they all did what they did on the American frontier. And they had these camp meetings, and thousands of people very often would camp out on the grounds, and they would have their wagons and their tents and all this sort of stuff. And they would have different preaching spots, and people would assemble in these preaching spots. And Methodists particularly were involved, Presbyterians were, Baptists were. So it was interdenominational, although I think it became mainly a Methodist thing later.
Right. But the Cane Ridge is the kind of like primary example of that.
Yep.
Right.
Cane Ridge.
1801.
Yep.
Kentucky. Out in the middle of nowhere, hardly anybody lives there, and 25,000 people show up. Isn't something like that, right?
That's the sort of thing.
It's like It's like Woodstock with preachers.
Yeah. Yes, very much. And it made the modern Pentecostal services look tame, because it was really wild, really crazy.
Yeah. When you say wild, what do you mean?
Well, okay.
Describe that.
One fellow who had witnessed it moved away from it because he was overcome by all the emotion and everything that's going on, people crying out, shouting out, and all this. So he moved away from it, and he said he saw hundreds of people fall down in one sweep, moved by the Spirit of God, and they fell down in one sweep like that. Now that's pretty wild. That's pre-Pentecostal by 100 years.
Well,
that's right.
Yeah.
But that's the sort of thing which happened. And they did, as the years progressed, the camp meetings tamed down, and they became a bit more for Christians rather than non-Christians, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
But what by 1820, I think it was 1820, was the first example I saw of a printed program for a camp meeting, and it had invitation to the altar in the program. In other words, by 1820, in some camp meetings, one camp meeting at least, probably in some camp meetings, the altar call had become standardized.
Right.
So that, as I said before, is interdenominational. So Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and
they hadn't necessarily used that exact verbiage, altar call, but the practice
this is by memory, but I think they did say call to the altar.
Okay.
I think that, I'm not sure of that.
Okay.
But I think that was it.
And that's 1820.
I may be wrong. They were certainly calling people out to the altar, whether they was the implication. That so that was, I'm pretty sure, 1820 or 1821 thereabouts. So I mean, you're still really pre-Finney. This is before Finney's ministry began. That was later in the 1820s, wasn't it, Finney?
He was 29 before he became a Christian.
Yeah.
So he's only becoming a Christian 2 or 3 years after that.
That's right. 1792 he was born, wasn't he? Yes.
Yeah.
So this is all pre-Finney, at least pre-Finney preaching experience anyway. So you can't say that he started it, and people often say it. I see it everywhere, in books and websites and that it began with Finney, but it didn't. Definitely
right.
not.
And like you mentioned, it's very difficult to prove the negative.
Yes.
Because you're not going to find somebody saying, and we don't do this thing that you think we're going to do 100 years from now. It's, that's not going to happen. But you have a lot of people who can go quite a distance back making statements that are inaccurate.
Yes.
And then it becomes standard.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
That frequently happens.
Hmm.
Of course, when you do come to Finney, or let's go back a little bit before Finney, but this spread to Britain. It spread to Britain initially through Methodist preachers. Some Methodist preachers, Wesley had sent out Methodist preachers to America, and a couple of those brought it back to Britain in a very modest way, limited way.
Right.
But then you had Lorenzo Dow. Lorenzo Dow was one of the major American Methodist preachers in the camp meetings.
Okay.
And he went to Ireland and went to the British Isles generally, and he used the altar call there. So that would be, I think, in Ireland, 1799, and I think, again, I'm doing this from memory.
1799. Okay.
In Ireland.
Right.
And 1800 in England. I'm fairly sure those dates are right. They're close, at least.
Yeah.
So he made a couple of trips to Britain, and he used it there quite definitely, and then it gradually began to become common in certain sections of Methodism.
Right.
Then later, people like Finney, Calvin Colton, James Coy, American evangelists, went to Britain, and they all used it, and it became more popular, more common, and spread to other denominations.
Right, but it's coming from America to Britain, not as the thought would have been if Wesley had started it, it would have been the other way around, right?
That's right. That's right.
And so Francis Asbury is probably more likely to be influential in it than John Wesley.
Yeah, I'm sure Asbury used it. Yes.
Right.
Yes,
yeah, I found an instance.
Not quite sure when, but
I found an instance of when he was preaching in 1799. It said he preached, somebody else exhorted, and then it says, and the preacher called the people forward. But it was a generic preacher, so it was hard to tell which one of the preachers
was it Asbury or the exhorter.
right. Yeah. Or another guy who was running the meeting. But then shortly after that, within the next few years, a number of the Methodist circuit writers were talking about using the anxious bench. This was a I'm trying to, let me see if I can find it here. It was a Methodist guy. So this was Robert Coleman's Origin of the Altar Call in American Methodism. And within the next couple of years after this experience with Asbury, these other Methodist preachers were talking about using the same technique and calling it, this is very helpful for separating out people. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think you got enough on.
So that's where it comes from, and then it just kind of takes over all of evangelicalism, it seems.
Well, it's very visual. I mean, if you've got people trooping forward after a service, it looks good. It's impressive. Well, it does. I mean, it does.
It does.
You see Billy Graham crusade, and you get hundreds of people moving forward. That's very impressive,
right?
And it makes an impact upon people.
Sure.
And it does.
It's good for offerings to say we have numbers here to verify our success, and so support what we're doing. Yeah. I now in saying that, I sound pretty skeptical, as though we're using numbers to raise money, but kind of I suppose in a practical sense of it, that sometimes is true, isn't it? That we do
even perhaps when we don't intend to. I think
right. Right.
Subconscious, perhaps, or
sure. Well, I've had that pressure as a pastor, and then now traveling, people want to know. So, how many people receive the Lord? Can you give us numbers? And altar call and come forward. And there are some people they want to base whether they think something is worthy to give to upon numbers like that.
Numbers,
yeah.
I'm just.
The temptation of that is something else. It's yeah.
I'm not particularly wanting to rubbish people, but if you want to look at some odd figures, have a look at some of the Reinhard Bonnke figures.
Really?
Statistics.
Okay.
A bit sus.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't blame him for that, but his organisation, I don't think.
Sure. It tends to, it seems to be a systemic thing within evangelicalism. We have a new standard that perhaps wasn't a biblical one, and now we have a system, right? Yeah. And people want to know, are you working within that system well? So now, social, philosophical, theological background to this thing. How did we get here to this altar call becoming a standard activity?
Okay. There isn't any doubt at all that the theology of today with regard to conversion and evangelism is different from what it was 200 years ago. No question at all. The theology is different.
How so?
Okay, I'll come to that. Just let me do a bit of background first. But I think it's been influenced by changes in philosophy. You've got the emergence and popularization, I think, of the altar call happened against the backdrop of revolution in France, revolution in America.
Okay.
And you've got the American, the French philosophers, Jefferson and people like that in America, who are speaking about free will and people making their own decisions. So this is a very important one. So people can make their own decisions, people vote and that sort of thing. And this, in my understanding, impacted upon how we view conversion.
Okay.
So that conversion, instead of being primarily a work of God, is seen more as a human decision. I decided for Christ, that sort of thing. And that language, I wouldn't say I haven't seen it in the 18th century, but I think I've only seen it once in the 18th century. But in the 19th century, it becomes more and more common. The idea of I decided for Christ. So that's one way in which the theology is changing. There's a greater emphasis upon what the convert does, what the prospective convert does, and less upon what God does.
Right.
I don't think there's any doubt that this is true. Some might say, yeah, okay, well, what's wrong with that? But it's changed, definitely.
Right. And it's, so I've been looking at that same dynamic, and of course with Jonathan Edwards, you had him exhorting the sinner to cry out for God's acceptance, right?
Yes.
And interestingly, despite the fact that Finney would be looked at as being far more Arminian in his theology and emphasizing the free will of the individual to make a choice, it was still cry out to God for him to accept you.
But it was expected that he would.
Right. And if you do that, God will accept you, but cry out for him to accept you. But today, we accept Jesus.
Yes.
So
that is, I think, a 19th century, late 19th century, 20th century thing even.
Okay.
As recent as that, certainly 19th century.
Okay.
I'll get on to that when we look at the sinner's prayer.
Oh, yeah.
We'll look at the accepting and receiving Christ and that sort of thing. Trying to remind myself what I was going to say.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Anyway, I think the thing I'm arguing here is in this section is that the evangelical understanding of conversion and theology has been influenced by secular philosophy.
Okay.
Now, that would horrify a lot of people, but because of this idea that we can make decisions, this stronger emphasis on decision making for the individual, I think has come into evangelical theology and evangelical practice. And so you get this talk of he made a decision, she made a decision, and so on and so forth. And is a Christian conversion primarily, I'm not saying there is no decision involved, but is Christian conversion primarily a human decision? I think that's what we need to ask ourselves. If it is primarily a human decision, is it worth much? Is it worth much?
Or are we saving ourselves?
Yeah, well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, everybody would agree, of course, that God's involved. Nobody would say he wasn't.
Right.
But sometimes I get the impression that God is kind of sort of, I can't make up your mind, will you, down there, and decide for me, will you? Just sitting there doing nothing.
Right.
But God is involved, heavily involved in a person coming to Christ. And I think, I wouldn't say that's been lost, but I think it's been pushed back. And I think that's a great loss, and certainly a great change.
Right.
Definitely a great change.
And so the altar call is a fundamental part of that transition in philosophy.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I think it's either that or a mighty good coincidence that it emerged at the same time. You got the French philosophers, French Revolution, and then the American Revolution, and the American philosophers coming in the early 19th century, and so on. And,
sure. I'm currently reading I'm currently reading a doctorate that just was completed 2020. A guy by the name of Sean Welch did a study on the evangelical influences upon pragmatism.
Oh, right. Okay. That's an interesting one.
It is really interesting. And so the dynamics of he looks at Jonathan Edwards, then Charles Finney, and this issue of choice being fundamental thinking that brought about some influence to Henry James, and then, concurrently to his son, William James, the big pragmatist, the biggest of the pragmatists. The most famous of them. It's and so much of it has to do with the human affection, as Edwards and Finney called it, the affections, and then the affections are, in a sense, where the volition of the individual lies, right?
Yes.
And so this choice, and within pragmatism, what we do, the effects of our activity are somehow birthed in the initial actions we take. That end product is even birthed in my initial activity, right? So the volition is very important. That's why it's such a great American philosophy, pragmatism. Interesting thoughts of, indeed, how does this altar call come about? It's not in a vacuum, is it?
No, it isn't. Nothing is. Theology, 21st century theology, which is, I guess, changing in some ways again. And it's impacted by events in society, things which are happening in society,
right?
And everything impacts upon everything. I think
right.
Christianity isn't. We don't live our Christian lives in a void. We live in a sinful world, a world which sometimes knocks us about a little bit. not because specifically because we're Christians, but just because the world knocks us about. And that impacts upon how we view things, and impacts our theology. And none of us develop our thinking in a vacuum. It's all in this mass. I don't know what to call it, but this mass mess. Perhaps that's the best way to call it, a mass mess. Right. And that's how we develop our ideas as well as we can.
So it's interesting that this altar call, it's rising from 1800 to 1820. You see this development of it, and then it becomes more and more popular. It seems to be happening in tandem with the move westward in America. And is there something about that movement that helps drive this?
I don't know that is necessarily so.
Right.
New world, new ideas. I don't think necessarily.
Right.
But I think one issue which might lie behind it a bit. I think in a lot of cases that the clergy didn't necessarily move with the people. The people very often moved out. And I think the teaching in some cases may have been a bit fragile. Trying to put it up politely, but
right. Well, those Methodist circuit riders, it was kind of like, you receive Jesus, slap them on the back if they're zealous, and send them out, right?
Well, that's right. And of course, that was even more so in the days of the Salvation Army, which is another one of my things.
Okay.
Convert them one week and have them on a street corner preaching the next week.
Right.
But that's. I can't sort of completely really place that moving westward with it.
Right. It isn't.
Perhaps.
Yeah,
it's understandable.
Yeah.
That idea is understandable.
Right, and it's interesting how the medicine shows and the traveling drummers or traveling salesmen and the preachers with their show are all going together and all looking for responses.
That's right.
And all seem to be doing the same thing.
That's right.
Come up and buy your snake oil, right?
Yeah, you'll get saved.
Yeah.
There's a similarity to certainly there.
Right. It does make me wonder to some degree to what sense perhaps is the church learning from capitalism? Are the capitalists learning from the church, or is it a symbiotic relationship where they're kind of tossing ideas back and forth?
It's a bit of mutual sharing, I think.
Right. You see what that guy did over there? That was awesome. I'm going to try it. And pretty soon, we look like a Punch and Judy.
Well, as I said, we don't live in a vacuum, so we are, all of us, are influenced by our surroundings and the people we are involved with, Christian and otherwise. And to think that we're not is silly.
Right. Okay, so we have this social, philosophical, theological background creating this dynamic. Now, you mentioned here that there's a sacramental aspect to the altar call. What?
Okay, altar call. Okay, certainly some of the churches, Methodist definitely, and some others used to invite people forward. I started my days as a Methodist, and this is what we did. The people moved forward to take Holy Communion, to take the Lord's Supper. So you came forward and took the elements at the Lord's Supper. Now, it's terribly easy, but hard to prove. Terribly easy to understand, but hard to prove, that going forward for the Lord's Supper made it easier for people to go forward to the altar. The altar, notice the language,
right?
To make a decision for Christ or whatever.
Right.
So that there is an imaginable link there.
Right.
And certainly, as I say, there would have been, if you're inviting people forward to be saved, as it were, and you've got a nice place to kneel, a nice rail to kneel at, to the side of. Well, that's probably what a lot of people did.
Right.
And
right.
It was just not necessarily second nature, but it was in their programming, their Christian programming.
And in the Methodist Church, there's the altar table, but there's also like an altar rail.
Yes, there's there's a table, and then outside the table is a rail, and then in the church I was at, a cushioned kneeler, so one piece, one. So we knelt down and we took the elements, and that, as I understand it, was common in Methodism. I guess comes from the Anglican origins, Church of England origins.
Sure.
And I think other Methodist influenced churches may have also done that. Not quite sure about that, but the Methodists were big anyway, big and influential. So that just sort of linked. And I think, especially when you hear this name, the description altar call, the title altar call, is not used very much in England nor Australia. It's very much it's mainly an American thing.
Really?
Yeah, we tend to use public invitation or public appeal. Use that more.
Okay, so American evangelicals are utilizing that title, altar call, almost.
Certainly more often than their English-speaking compatriots. Yes.
Right.
In my experience, anyway. Certainly, when I was growing up in the Methodist Church, it was a public invitation or altar call, not altar call. Anyway, public invitation, or public appeal. That was the other. The other phrase used. And but certainly in the American setting, you've got this idea of the altar call, and it's easy to link it to the Lord's Supper. Sure. When you get on to baptism, there are some people, Baptists particularly, some Baptists are a bit concerned. Baptists use it a lot, of course. I was a Baptist as well, so I've been around. Some Baptists are a little concerned that the altar call might replace baptism in some people's thinking. I've been out to the front. I've made a decision for Christ. I've made my confession, as it were. Why would I need to be baptized? Because baptism in Baptist setting is very much seen as a confession before people. So I think G. Beasley Murray was one who was a little bit afraid that the altar call might replace baptism in people's thinking in Baptist circles. So he was a Baptist scholar. So there's that kind of link, a negative link, if you like, I suppose.
Right. So somebody's asking the question here. Do we see the altar call mentioned in early hymns?
Depends how early is early.
Okay.
Was it Doddridge? 18th century, of course. The chorus to his hymn, "A Happy Day That Fixed My Choice," but I don't think he wrote the chorus. So who wrote the chorus? I don't know.
Right.
It depends how early is early. I think you see it more in the Sankey's Sacred Songs and Solos, sort of 1870 later and later.
Okay.
Then
and then he get it. So this Donald Rylander who's asking this, and then he mentions, I have decided to follow Jesus.
Yeah, I can't tell you when that was written, but that's
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That, as I said earlier on, was the theology which was emerging in the 19th century.
Right.
So,
yeah. Wow. Okay, so on this idea of being a sacramental aspect of it, something that I think you've mentioned this, and some other people who've talked about the altar call, is that it's almost as if within evangelicalism, which tends to pride itself in having only the sacraments that we find in the Bible, right? We have baptism and we have the Lord's Supper, and those are our sacraments. We're not going to add anything to that.
That's right.
But it almost seems at times that the altar call has become a type of sacrament for the church, right?
Yeah, I think it probably has. And
am I stepping on some people's toes by saying it like that?
Well, you probably are, but I suspect that doesn't usually stop you. But,
no, you're absolutely right.
But I don't think it's usually. I've never heard it defined that well. Only in one or two academic things have I heard it defined that way, I think.
Okay.
To a couple of books. People don't usually think of it that way out loud.
Right.
I suspect that some people certainly regard it as a very holy interaction, if one can put it that way. So it's almost as good as the Lord's Supper and baptism, you know. I think it's more a non-verbal, not something which isn't spoken, but believed. That would be my sense.
Right, and that certainly seemed like when I mentioned earlier that as a young pastor, I was very uncomfortable with the concept of altar calls every Sunday, especially when you have a small church and you know everybody who's there. I mean,
that's right. Yeah,
there was one guy, Rick McDonald. He would say, I was never quite sure when I was saved, and I probably went to the altar 30 times, and I would jokingly say, "Oh my gosh, there's going to be 30 Rick McDonalds in heaven." you got saved. There's another one of you for every altar call you responded to. So we would joke about that, but it felt to me, if I was to give an altar call all the time, I felt like I felt a bit like a traveling salesman. I felt a bit like a huckster. And of course, this is in the day when, in America, Ma Bell was breaking up, and you had all the baby bell companies, and you get a phone call, and in that phone call, somebody would say that they could set you up for long distance that would service that would be cheaper, and you'd have all these sales calls, and you'd know a sales call when it came because the phone would ring, you'd pick it up, there'd be a silence that had a slight hiss behind it.
That's right, yes.
There'd be a click, some background noise in a room, and somebody would say something. And you would hear that, and you'd slam the phone down right away. You wouldn't want to have that call. And I always felt that doing an altar call all the time, I felt like I was that, MCI or whoever it was, long distance salesman, And
you were doing the click.
Yeah, I was doing the hiss, and they were hanging up the phone, right? and people were quite sensitive to it in the 80s and 90s, right? Yeah. The days in which we live have somewhat changed, but it still was so expected that it felt like, it was that unspoken rule. There was an unwritten code, and felt like it was necessary to the life of the service that I do it.
I don't think that, in my experience, limited though it may be, I don't think that has been like that generally in British and Australian churches.
Okay.
With the possible exception of Churches of Christ in Australia. I think some of the Churches of Christ churches tend to do it every week, but other than that, I'm not aware of any that do. I don't think this. Give my book a plug. There we are. The altar call, its origins and present usage. That's the book.
Okay, absolutely.
Now, I don't think that book has got the full details of a survey I did. I did a survey in Australia about churches that use the altar call and how often they did it, and churches like Baptist Church of Christ Salvation Army did it very frequently, or every week, or at least very frequently. Some other churches did it much less often. Some didn't do it at all. But the full details of that survey I did are actually in the original dissertation. I didn't transfer everything over into the book, but certainly some of that kind of material is in the book. The book, by the way, I better tell you, is expensive. I'm sorry, can't do anything about it.
One of those academic things.
There's no ebook. I'm sorry, but certainly quite a lot of libraries have got it.
Okay.
America, so it's a question of looking around if people want to see it. But I was very pleased that I think it was 2019. I think the Gospel Coalition did an article on the history of the altar call, and my book was the book they used.
Okay,
so that
excellent.
Was very encouraging.
I have to say, for anybody who would look at anything you've written or would want to interview you, reading your stuff and talking to you, both personally prior to this and now, you are an impeccable researcher, and I respect that so much, because so much that happens within Christian writing today is so poorly researched, and assumptions are made on, and that's not just in popular circles. Sometimes that's even in so-called academia.
Yeah.
So I've given you a plug. Thank you for being
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
An impeccable researcher. Yeah.
Okay. With regard to a lot of bad research, you've seen nothing until you have seen. I know you have seen it. The Left Behind stuff. People trying to prove Left Behind goes back to the early church.
Right.
Some of the stuff there is appalling. Really, it's embarrassing.
I know. I became a Christian in 1980. I wasn't raised in a church, and so I became a Christian at 21 in 1980. And it was in the heat of Jesus is returning in 1981, right?
Yeah.
With the whole Hal Lindsey, was at the late great Planet Earth, and Chuck Smith with Calvary Chapel telling us that this is the year Jesus is going to come, and then he'd kind of go, probably, but it was like this, and I was reading the Bible and thinking, where on earth are they getting this stuff?
Yeah,
I was brand new to it and thinking, wow, I don't get it. So, we create things out of whole cloth, it seems. Now, I do want to cycling back here to the your altar call, and then perhaps the emergence of the sinner's prayer as well. That now they come like a package, right? Yes. It's a package deal, 2 for 1, with every eye closed and every head bowed. Now,
I've heard that before.
Right. If you would like to receive Jesus into your heart tonight, lift your hand. And then they're called forward, and then people say a prayer together. But so you're seeing some abuses, what you would call abuses of the system, problems with it that creates for the church?
Yes, I think
I'm going to get you in trouble by asking that question, aren't I?
No, not really. Well, if you do it, it doesn't really matter, because I'm probably already in trouble because I've got it down in writing. So
there you go.
It's in the book.
You're a certified heretic.
It's in the book. But I think some of the problems are that I think just by inviting people forward, some preachers, and I'm choosing my words carefully, some preachers give the impression that coming forward saves. They don't quite say that, but they do give that impression. And other people who are witnessing it, record it, or perhaps on radio, TV, or in print media, they give the impression 20 people went forward, 20 people were saved. Now, anybody who's done any counselling at crusades or whatever knows that if you get 20 people come forward, there will be 20 different reasons why they came forward.
Right.
They might, someone might genuinely want to know the Lord. Someone might want perhaps to rededicate their lives, perhaps offer for missionary service. Some might just want more information, just want to know more. And some might just want to stretch their legs.
Or they want a few bucks.
Yeah. So, yeah, well, that's right. That's the other possibility. So you cannot assume that everybody who goes forward is a new Christian. Another thing that really bugs me is some preachers make what I call dishonest appeals. They will say things like, while every eye is closed, I want you, if you want to receive the Lord, I want you to raise your hand. While every eye is closed, no one will see but me. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. And then after that, they go, you can all open your eyes. And now would all those people please come forward? So what was originally a secret, private transaction suddenly becomes public. And I think that is not fair. It's crooked, and I've seen it done. So don't anyone tell me nobody does it, because some do.
I have seen it as well.
So, and it's just not fair. It's not honest. And I think when we're dealing with the things of Christ above all, we should be honest. I mean, if we're presenting the Christian gospel and we're not honest, then I think that's shameful. I really do.
Wow. I'm with you. One of the things I worry about within this combination of the altar call and then its extension into the counseling and the saying of a sinner's prayer with somebody, and there's somebody else leading you through that process of coming to meet God, right?
Yep.
Now, as evangelicals, it seems that we've held tightly onto the concept that there's one mediator between man and God, the man Christ Jesus. Yep. So our interaction is with Jesus and Jesus alone. But too often, like in the sinner's prayer, now you've said that prayer, and if you've said it honestly in your heart, you are a Christian, and you can be confident that you'll go to heaven and be with God. Now all of a sudden somebody else has played a mediatorial role in my salvation, in a very similar way that we as evangelicals would say that we have a problem with the confessional booth in the Catholic Church and somebody mediating that process of the forgiveness of sin. And of course there's different thoughts of that within Catholicism, but there is there's a very strong one of the priest standing in a mediatorial role, and evangelicals would say, no, I take my sins to Christ and he forgives me, right? But this feels almost as a mediatorship of some kind.
Okay, well, that kind of thing does predate the altar call. Interestingly, I think Wesley certainly counselled people, for example.
Right.
And trying to think of his name, Nevin, American evangelist Nevin. Can't think of his first name. John Nevin, anyway. He had the anxious seat, the anxious bench.
Okay,
But he didn't practice the altar call as such. But he did assemble people. Anybody who could see him after the service if you wanted to talk, about Christ and learn more and so forth. So even with a preacher, you are a kind of mediator, aren't you? So I think you've got to be a little bit careful with that one. So
right.
As a mediator.
Yeah. I suppose my concern is is the transition from somebody like Edwards and Finney, who would expect the evidence of salvation to occur within the individual because they've sensed through a dynamic experience with the Holy Spirit and with Christ that they have been forgiven of their sins and accepted by God. And Edwards looked for that evidence in an individual. Finney looked for that evidence in an individual. And today we kind of have even if you don't feel like it, you've been accepted by Christ. Yeah, right. Isn't there a little bit of that?
Yeah, even if you're just trying to please me.
Yeah. And so that becomes, is that Bonhoeffer's cheap grace?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think we're certainly in that area, aren't we? When we're dealing with those sort of things, that I know it all comes so easily. And I remember a friend of mine who was in my Bible study group a number of years ago, and she said, and she read a lot. She was one of those people that read a lot of biographies and so on. And she said, when I read these old biographies, it used to take people such a long time to become a Christian. Nowadays, it all happens in a few minutes. And I thought, yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah.
Or often, anyway. And you have to ask the question, and she was a sensible woman. She was asking the question, why? Why is that? Where are we? Were they wrong? Were we wrong? What's happening?
Yeah. And I know, at least for my personal experience, I do feel a little bit more like Finney, who scratched it out with God in the woods, right? And I just don't have it. Did I commit the unpardonable sin? What's happened? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm familiar with that.
Yeah. So I for me it was there was radical personal searching, and much of a whether it's an Edwardsian or a Finian type of experience. Similarly, there was something.
Takes the time. It's often. Yeah. Everybody's different.
Right. But it does seem that it's like she said. Why is it so easy today?
You want something on a sinner's prayer?
Yeah. We've only got a couple minutes here, but kind of give me some thoughts on the sinner's prayer here.
Okay. Well, the sinner's prayer, as it is used today I won't define it because it would take a while, but in such booklets as 4 Spiritual Laws or Steps to Peace with God, that kind of prayer, which if you pray it sincerely, it guarantees your salvation. That's what that the prayer or the notes attached to it say. That if you pray it sincerely and so forth, then you're saved. Now, I think, and I haven't been able to prove, I think that kind of prayer didn't emerge until the late 19th century, 1870s, maybe 1880s, more likely. So it's a recent kid on the block. And
even newer than the altar call. Yeah.
And the earliest printed form of it I found is in 1922. So the earliest printed form I found is 1922. The earlier ones are my guesses based on people's theology and behavior, not any printed evidence.
Right.
Then I don't think, we mentioned Paul Chitwood before, and he did this marvelous thing on the tracts produced by the American Tract Society from 1825 to 1950. 1825 to 1950.
Wow.
And not one of them had a sinner's prayer. Not one of them. That's the American Tract Society. After that, the sinner's prayer came in. So the sinner's prayer, I think, as a common evangelistic tool, didn't become common until after the Second World War.
Okay. And through people like Billy Graham, obviously.
Yeah, and particularly the other fellow, the other Bill.
Bill Bright?
Bill Bright. Yeah, Bill Bright.
Yeah. And he's a little bit later because he doesn't become influential till the early 60s.
Yes, but very influential with 4 spiritual laws.
And so training people to do that in personal evangelism.
Yes,
right.
That's right. But I mean, if anybody finds earlier examples of these practices, I'd really like to know.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not afraid to change my opinions, but these things seem to me, particularly the sinner's prayer, seem to be recent. Now, someone's going to tell me, I'm sure, that George Whitefield used the sinner's prayer, and yes, George Whitefield did use the sinner's prayer, but it was very different. If you read it and compare it, it's very different. It's longer, it's more theological, and it does not assume that if you pray it sincerely or otherwise that you will be saved.
Right.
It does not assume that.
Right. I remember reading it in your book on the sinner's prayer. Yeah.
And I think that's an important point to bear in mind. So we're talking about a particular type of prayer that assumes, in my opinion, assumes too much.
Okay.
That's the book, Sinner's Prayer.
Yeah.
I've got it up the right way. Yes, I have. There we are. Sinner's Prayer, Its Origins and Dangers.
Right. And they can find that on Amazon, right?
Yes, they can, and it is an ebook, it's a paperback and an ebook.
Okay. So, yeah. I got the ebook of it. Well-researched stuff that you do. We should probably close here. But I just want to say, I have been. I'm extremely thankful for your work because, you know, as I mentioned to you before we came on, I'm trying to trace out techniques, styles, and, you know, the major influences in evangelical evangelism through the 20th century, and like put them in a little list that says this happened, and I had expected somebody had already done that work, but nobody had done that work yet, and so now I'm having to tease out each of these things individually.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for the work of people like you who have looked into the sinner's prayer and the altar call, I don't know how I would have found the resources for the beginning of these points, because you've dug really deep to discover that, no, it wasn't Jesus that gave it to us. It was a combination of Presbyterian and Methodist camp meetings and circuit riders, and, you know, it's a bunch of American capitalists who gave us the altar call, and post World War II. Was it primarily America where this sinner's prayer is popping up again? Is it?
Yeah. My namesake, Dave Bennett, it's a different person, Dave Bennett, has been teasing out something in Britain as well. So I think even there, it's probably American influenced.
Okay.
So though I think there's a little bit of it going on before the Second World War in Britain, it's still American influenced.
Yeah, and, you know, and I hate to say it, but when we look at how it's being used right now, it's almost like the McDonald'sization of evangelicalism. We've created a bit of a fast food environment for fast tracking salvation. Yeah. Well, boy, thank you so much for all your work. It's been really helpful to me.
Pleasure, Phil.
Yeah,
thank you for having me.
And this is, I think this is going to be a great resource for people who want to know, where did the altar call come from? This guy has the answer.
Wow,
or at least, well, you know, at least as much as just about anybody knows right now.
Yeah.
You know, in the historical studies, you've dug as deep as anybody. So thank you so much for that. And people can connect with you on Facebook. Is that right? David Bennett?
Yes, that's fine.
Look for that handsome face with that beard that he strokes.
There are other Christian David Bennett. So
right.
Get the bloke with the beard and glasses.
Right. And right now at the top of my personal profile page is your picture, not my picture.
Okay.
People. So So thank you so much.
Okay,
That's been
Phil.
incredible. And for everybody who's watching, this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where we discover the world, God, the people in the world, even yourself. Things are wilder than you think. And you can support this on patreon.com/Phil Wyman. And you can find this where podcasts are found, as well as you'll be able to see this again here on Facebook or on YouTube. So thank you for checking in.